Our town, our TV. Amherst City Cable.
Good evening, I'm Jennifer Vasilk. Welcome to the Community Voice. My special guest tonight is Lieutenant Brandon Dimacchia from our very own Amherst Fire Department. He's here to talk about fire hydrant testing and a couple of other things that go on in the fire department. Thank you very much, Brandon, and welcome to the show.
Good evening, thanks for having me.
Let's talk about fire hydrant testing. There's been a lot of fire hydrant testing going on in the city, and we've seen some notices going out about it. And every once in a while, the city gets calls about water turning brown if fire hydrant testing's being done. First of all, why don't you just tell us why you do fire hydrant testing?
Well, we test fire hydrants because we want to make sure that when we arrive on scene at your house or at another structure that the fire hydrant is working, right? So every year there's a crew of firefighters that goes out and they check every single firefighter in the city and then everyone that's in the township in our fire district. They flow water from that hydrant just to get out all the sediment and all the debris and all the rocks and all the bad stuff that's been sitting inside of those large pipes underground for a long time. They flow all that out. The water, when it comes out, looks a little grungy. After it flows for a minute or so, it generally clears up. The guys lubricate all the threads, they put everything back together, and it's good to go. Sometimes they'll test the flow as well to see how many gallons per minute that it flows or what the pressure is on that hydrant as well. And you as a resident, you may, if we're in your neighborhood, you may find some of that crummy water that I was talking about earlier makes it into your house. Because if the water gets churned up in those big pipes underground, and normally as a resident you're just using a little bit of water compared to what we would use on the fire department. So when we come in and we churn all that up, that brown stuff makes it into your house. So when you turn on your faucet and you see all this crummy water coming out, you think, oh geez, is there a problem? Well, there is temporarily. If you turn it on, leave it on cold and let it flow for a minute or so, everything should be fine. Don't turn on the hot water because then it might go into your hot water tank. So we'll keep it on cold and we'll keep it flowing. Yeah.
Okay, so make sure it's cold water that we run.
Absolutely.
Okay. You test every year, you test every single fire hydrant that's in the city and out in the township that where this fire department covers. How many fire hydrants is that?
Well, in the city there's roughly 600, give or take a few here and there, and in the township there's probably 200 to 300 as well. We cover, our fire district at the Amherst Fire Department is everything north of the Turnpike. So and then the South Amherst Fire Department would cover everything south of the Turnpike. So that's a lot of hydrants, it's a lot of work.
Now, sometimes when I have seen activities with the fire hydrants, I see a group of maybe a half a dozen different firefighters, and usually there's a big spray of water involved in that. What's going on there? Are you testing a fire hydrant then?
Well, generally on Tuesday nights and Wednesday mornings, a lot of residents will see us around town because that's when we do our weekly training. So every week, every year, on Tuesday nights, Wednesday mornings, we practice. A lot of times we'll practice what we call hitting a hydrant. So, for example, you saw us recently out doing that same thing. We pull up to a hydrant, always different locations, just for different practice, because different hydrants have different sizes to them. They may need different wrenches. They have different fittings on the front. And we may hook them up to our pumpers a little bit differently in each case. So we'll arrive at a hydrant, we'll jump off, and every person on the pumper has a different job to do. So one person may open up some of the caps on the sides of the hydrant, open it up a bit, let all that crummy debris that we talked about earlier, let all that flow out. We'll close it down, put some valves on it, put some large diameter hose on that, hook that hose up to our pumper, and then turn on that hydrant when the pump operator is okay with you flowing the water from the hydrant into the pumper. Now, the water that comes from the hydrant into the pumper won't go in until the pump operator opens his valve so that the water can go in. Because in each of our pumpers in Amherst, we're fortunate, we have a lot of water already on them. So for example, our mainline engine, which is engine 59, we bring that to every structure fire in town. It's got 1,000 gallons of water already on it. So we can get a couple of attack lines off of that pumper and into your house or into the structure that's on fire and at least get some water flowing while the other guys are hooking that hydrant up and getting water from down in the ground to the hydrant and into the pumper.
So it takes a while to actually hook up the fire hydrants.
It does, but we practice a lot, so everybody should be pretty fluent with it and getting hooked up fairly quickly. You know, maybe a minute or so, depending upon where it's at. Some of them are a little bit lower, some a little higher. Some of them are maybe inundated with weeds and trees around them because they're not being kept up. But that's a little reminder to some of the residents out there to keep them clean so that there's no landscape around them. So we have good access.
So that if they have a fire at their house
Ready
or their
to go.
neighbors,
Yep, there's nothing in the way.
that there's nothing that
Absolutely.
if they have to maintain around that fire hydrant.
Absolutely.
So do you, I always thought that you hooked up the water lines that put out fires directly to the hose and then shot it into the house, but you're saying you actually, all the hoses that you put out like a structural fire are hooked up to your pumper.
Right, to the pumper, yeah.
That's the truck,
That's
of the
correct,
trucks.
yes.
Oh, okay.
So what happens is there's 1,000 gallons on our main line, engine 59. So we would arrive at the structure. We would pull off a couple smaller attack lines, an inch and 3/4 size. We would pull that off, flake all the hose out. The pump operator would turn on the pump. The water that's in that tank, 1,000 gallons, would flow into those lines, go to the front door, wherever the incident commander decides to make that attack. And then as that water is being depleted, of course, the tank volume is going down, and there's an indicator on the side of all of our vehicles, all of our pumpers and our tower ladder, of where that water level is at, so that everybody on the fire ground can see where it's at, especially the pump operator. And then as that water is being used, of course the water level is going down. That should be right around the time that the fire hydrant begins flowing. That crew has that water going, and then it goes through a large diameter hose through the front of the fire hydrant, comes out and goes into a couple different places on the pumper. It could go on through the side and then through the front. Each one's set up a little bit differently.
Okay, so. And do you have, it's one hydrant per pumper? If you have another pumper come on?
That's a good question. Every situation is a little bit different. It all depends on how much water that we're flowing from that pumper. So the smaller the fire, generally one hydrant is okay. Sometimes just the water that's in the tank is okay if it's just a small fire. But the more water that you use, we may have to use another hydrant. There's a little key though. If we use one hydrant on one side of the street and then just go down to the next hydrant, that water comes from the same pipe underground.
Right.
So what we have to do is we have hydrant maps. We need to take a hydrant that is using a different water main on a different part. So rather than trying to steal more water off of the same pipe, we try to get on to two different ones. Sometimes it's a little bit farther down the road.
And so you boost the pressure.
We boost the gallons per minute, yeah, the flow, the volume of water that we need is what we're looking for.
What's the fastest amount of time you can use up that 1,000 gallons of reserve that you have in your tank?
The way that a pumper is labeled is that every time there's a discharge, so in other words, every time there's a pipe that comes off of the pumper to flow water, that's rated at 250 gallons per minute. So our pumpers are all rated at 1,500 gallons per minute, so that means there's 6 discharges on there. Now, the chances of having that is, and the chances of having all 6 of those going at once are pretty slim. Generally, it's 2 attack lines, maybe a backup line, and then we're going to involve another pumper with a different water supply. But every situation is a bit different. It all depends on what type of fire that we're having, and what the volume of fire that we have, and what type of building it is.
Now, the other day when I was going for a walk, I noticed that there was a fire hydrant on the corner. It was actually on the corner of Sipple and Lincoln. And there was a little puddle of water next to it. And I let the utilities department know, and they said it had been broken or whatever during fire department testing.
Right.
Does that happen very often, and is that a problem?
What happens is when we go out and test the hydrants, the water that is going through the pipes underground the volume gets increased, which is much more different from a normal residence use. So you at home, when you're cooking or you're taking a shower or whatever the normal family use is, you're not using that much water. The fire department comes along, we use a lot of water to put out a fire, so we're putting a bigger strain on all those pipes that are underground. And our city has a little bit of an aged water system underground because Amherst has been around for a while. So when we go out and test, we flow a lot of water, we put a little bit of strain on the system, and occasionally we do have a break. But the utilities department is pretty good at repairing those hydrants. And to go on that same note, when we replace the hydrants, they're putting a new hydrant with some different style connectors on them now that make things a little bit better for us as well.
So a little bit easier to use.
We used to use on all the hydrants, if you look around town, you can see They're starting to get a little bit more scarce now, but on the front of a older hydrant, you'll see a threaded cap on the front
Right.
of the barrel. Okay, so that's more of the old style. The newer ones will have smaller caps on either side, 2.5-inch discharge, but on the front you'll see a different cap with just a little wire hanging there and holding it. That's called a Storrs connection. A Storrs connection just takes a quarter turn, not even a quarter turn, to pull that cap off and to take our 5-inch diameter hose that we're going to use for the supply into the pumper. It's got the same type of connection on it. There's no male or female. Either side goes together either way. You just grab it and you give it a nice little click and it's in there. It's much easier than years ago with the old threaded style where you had to keep threading this cap on over and over and worrying about all the rocks and dirt and such getting in the way. It's much quicker now.
Oh,
so you'll see around town a lot, just like you saw, a newer hydrant has the Storrs connections on them versus the old threaded ones.
Well, Brandon, thank you very much for coming on the show today, and that was very interesting about all the information you gave us about the fire hydrant testing. This is Jennifer Vasilk, and you've been listening to The Community Voice with my special guest tonight, Lieutenant Brandon Dimacchia from the Amherst Fire Department. Thank you, and good night.
Serving Amherst and Amherst Township, your hometown television station, Amherst City Cable.